Birders, Joe the Springbrook Birder for the DuPage Birding Club. Today we're going to talk about separating the woodpeckers by their calls. This is one in a series of videos that the DuPage Birding Club is providing so that its members can have some education material, and hopefully that will make them better birders. And in particular, this is one of a series of videos that I'm doing regarding bird by ear, which is being able to identify birds by their calls. So let's get started. There are 7 species of woodpeckers that normally can be found in DuPage County. I'm sure that most of you are familiar with all of our woodpeckers, since they are frequently seen during most field trips to wooded areas within the county. The downy, hairy, red-bellied, and pileated woodpeckers are permanent residents and can be found here throughout the year. Flickers and red-headed woodpeckers are predominantly summer residents, but some may stay around for the winter. And the sapsucker is generally only seen during migration as they pass through Illinois between their wintering and breeding grounds. In terms of abundance, we have seen some recent trends, especially for the pileated woodpecker. It used to be that the pileated was very rare in DuPage County. But as the trees in our forest preserves have gotten larger over the past 20 to 30 years, they've really been increasing. So now you can find them fairly regularly in several locations. On the other hand, there has been a large decrease in the number of red-headed woodpeckers in the county, and the cause for their decline is not fully known. Woodpeckers are easily separated by their field marks, since they have pretty distinct plumages and patterns, as well as differences in their size and bill characteristics. So except for perhaps the hairy and downy woodpeckers, you should not have very many problems with identifying the species of woodpecker. Even separating downy and hairy woodpeckers is not that difficult once you learn the key things to look for visually. Dennis Kanya has a mini tutorial on that topic in another DBC YouTube channel video. Although our woodpeckers can be separated and identified using our binoculars, it's also helpful to learn about the calls and songs of woodpecker. Knowing the call notes and sounds they make help us in our ID and also alerts us to the presence of woodpeckers that we can't see. Now, woodpeckers don't sing, but they do make sounds. They use call notes and other sounds to communicate. They also use drumming to establish and defend their territories. So woodpecker drumming is somewhat the equivalent of bird songs. Here's an example of drumming. The woodpecker makes that drumming sound by tapping rapidly on the trunk of a tree. And often they use hollow trees or dead branches so that the sound really reverberates. Identifying woodpeckers through drumming is difficult, since the drumming of many species sound the same, but it can be done for a couple species. And I'll talk about that later. But the call notes that woodpeckers make can be used to separate them, since each one has rather unique and different calls. Let's start with 2 of the most common ones that we see, downy and hairy woodpeckers. The calls of the downy woodpecker are heard here. Although you can think of the downy as somewhat of a sharp note, there is also a soft tone to it. So it is a one-note call that is often repeated. Now here's the calls of the hairy woodpecker. The hairy call is similar to that of the downy, but it is sharper and generally louder, but of course that depends on how far away the bird is. So how do you tell them apart? Downy and hairy can be difficult to separate, but the downy call sounds more like a single note, while the hairy call sounds more like it has two separate notes. And the hairy is also sharper. So here's the downy again. And now the hairy. I think the key difference to focus on is that the hairy call is a two-note call and is sharper, while the downy is a one-note call. I hope you pick up on the two-note nature of the hairy. I think you'll be able to hear that difference in the field once you are aware of it and are listening for it. The flicker is a commonly heard species here in the spring and summer. It is a series of single notes that are put together in a long string. And it also has some individual call notes. All three of those notes are pretty characteristic, help us identify a flicker even from a long distance away. I think you might confuse a flicker only with this next species, the pileated woodpecker. You would expect a pileated to have a louder sound, and they do, but I think the important characteristic of the call is the quality and tone of the call as well as its cadence. So while the calls may superficially remind you of a flicker, to me, the individual notes have more of a whistle quality and are not as nasal as a flicker. Pileated also has more variation, becoming faster and higher as the call continues, while as you heard, the flicker is more uniform. I've also played the drumming of the pileated because I think that's one of a couple species where you can tell the differences and identify the woodpecker by its drumming. It has a very distinctive form and cadence to it. Now, to add a little confusion to this, there's also this sound. Now, if you're out in a wooded area and hear that, you might think that it might be a pileated or flicker. Well, it's actually this guy, the Cooper's hawk. Adult Cooper's hawks give that call when they are around their nest in the springtime. So if you hear a series of single notes that you think might be a flicker or pileated, just remember that you have to also separate the Cooper's hawk. Our next species is the red-headed woodpecker. Here are examples of its call. It is a relatively soft, long single note call. I think you have to listen to it several times to get that sound into your mind for it to register. Then it's fairly distinctive. Now we come to one of the most common sounds you hear, one that is very distinctive, the red-bellied woodpecker. You will hear red-bellied calls all over DuPage County. The calls can be heard from relatively long distances at all time of year. The call has a distinctive warbled quality to it. There's a lot going on in that single call note. Once you recognize it, you should not have any trouble recalling the red-bellied woodpecker. And now for our seventh woodpecker species, yellow-bellied sapsucker. This species is primarily a migrant throughout DuPage County, but some occasionally winter in our areas. Here's the call of the sapsucker. Here's the drumming call. The drumming. So the sapsucker call is pretty unique. It is somewhat high, and I would characterize it as very squeaky compared to other woodpeckers. My experience is that you don't often hear that call compared to our summer resident species. Keeping that sound in the back of your mind might help you locate one as they migrate through the area. As for the drumming, I think you'll hear that it has a very unique cadence to it. It's kind of a pause there in the middle. So I think that's the second species that you might be able to identify by drumming when you hear it. So what are some of the key points on separating the woodpeckers by call? First, For the downy and hairy woodpeckers, their calls are similar in form, a single note that is often repeated. But it's not fast enough to be strung together to make a trill. The key to telling them apart is that downies have a one-note call, whereas hairies have a two-note call, sharper and with more emphasis on the second note. You might also confuse the red-bellied, which is a much more smooth-sounding call of the red-headed woodpecker. But remember, the red-bellied has a really warbled call with a lot of variation in each note. And I think the red-headed call sounds much more uniform. Then on the flicker and pileated, they're also similar. They're a series of notes put together in a slow trill. The difference there is that flickers have a more uniform call, while the pileated has more variation. It tends to be faster and higher towards the end. There's also that difference in cadence. So I think that's some of the key points to remember out there in the field when you're looking for woodpeckers. So the 7 species of woodpeckers in Illinois, I think, can be readily separated easily by their plumages and what they look like. However, they can also be separated by their calls. So knowing the calls will help you ID the woodpeckers more quickly and easily. And I think separating the calls is really possible with some practice. But also, you got to be aware of variation in calls. As in other birds, not all individuals sound alike. So you have to practice and listen and get that variation that might be out there in the field down, but take care to listen to those very key characteristics of the species that make the sounds different. So now it's quiz time. Let's see how you do in recognizing the woodpeckers. Get a piece of paper and pencil and jot down your answers to the following bird quiz. Here's number 1. Number 2. Third one. Or number 5. Number 6. And the last one. Okay, hopefully you did well and you recognized all those different ones. So here's the answers. I hope the mini tutorial helped and that you got them all right. If not, don't worry. It just takes more practice in the field, and then you'll be an expert in no time. So I hope you enjoyed the video and found it useful. Please check out similar information on other groups of birds through the DuPage Birding Club YouTube education channel. For the DuPage Birding Club, this is Joe the Springbrook Birder. Good birding.